Hey, Ian, we generally go to GDC in
Yeah,
March. I've gone consistently since 2016. You've gone off and on over the years.
yeah,
And then all of our plans went awry.
yep.
And then they oddly scheduled GDC for August. And we're like, well, that seems premature.
Yeah, wishful thinking turns out.
Yeah. But they did have eventually a GDC summer program, which both of us had press passes for and were able to participate in last week. Just kind of overall, like what are you thinking about how it ended up?
I very much appreciate that they did it, that they tried something, that they filled in the gap. I really liked the website that they came up with. The interface I thought was really good. You could schedule your appointments, and the or streams or videos would start a couple minutes before, and there's a chat and questions and all that. And so that was all very cool. Um, some of the talks I saw were really good. Some were fine. But yeah, I mean, I think they did the best they could with the situation that we find ourselves in.
Yeah, I think the session stuff really, is the part that shine. That's the part that came through. A
Yeah,
lot of the other things that they had in terms of like trying to connect people and get you to virtual booths and stuff, they kind of just bounced off me. And I don't know if it's partly because I'm doing this from home and I don't have the time to just like dive in and spend my whole day trying to sort this stuff out. Um,
and
but at the same
part
time,
of me wonders also if we're not the target audience for that. Like, I that's probably mostly like trying to get indie devs to meet publishers or whoever too, or each other.
right. Well, and I think that's part of it is like you see some, boot quote unquote virtual booth, and it's just like book a meeting. I'm like, book a meeting
For
to
what?
to
Yeah,
what exactly? And I think part of what played into that is I didn't have very many contacts messaging me about this event either. So like
right.
generally when I do GDC, I'm not doing it through any other site. I'm doing it just through my general emails, people that I'm in contact with or who get my name off the press list.
Yeah,
They
PR
get in touch
people.
and they're like, hey, this is what we have. Do you want to come by? And I just organize it all that way.
Yeah,
In terms of what they did have, though, obviously, I think there were a lot of presentations that either were repackaged some other way before this, or that just got completely skipped over, um, or whatever. I mean, the Unreal one we've mentioned on the podcast was like one of the biggest things that like that was supposed to be at GDC
right.
that debut. They made a big deal out of inviting everybody to that. Um, I'd say that with the sessions, the weirdest part, and I have this issue like with the online church services my church does too, is trying to focus on the session while there's chat going on.
Yeah.
And it's like the person is talking right now and there's all this stuff zooming by, and some of it is like, oh well, I see somebody I know, and then you chat or you try to like type a message and then you're like, wait, what are we talking about now? Because some of these go by pretty fast anyways.
Yeah.
And so actually one of the things I appreciated was after 2 days went by, they sent us an email and let us know that, hey, you can actually go back and watch sessions from those days. And that actually made it a lot easier for me to digest some of the stuff. Like, okay, let
Yeah.
me pause,
Pausing.
write
Yeah.
this down, let me rewind what I need to rewind and all of that. And I
Well,
felt like,
and like so many of the sessions were at like 7 a.m., and I'm just like,
yeah,
uh, this sounds mildly interesting, but I'm not gonna get up at 6:30 to, watch a thing that is probably like over my head anyway.
yeah. Thankfully, not too much of it was over my head.
Yeah,
We'll get
yeah,
to our individual sessions, but there were a couple, but not too much was over my head.
yeah. Same.
Yeah, so let's maybe kick it off. The first one to kick it off for me was Brenda Romero's Hidden
Oh
Histories.
yeah, I watched this one too.
Oh, cool.
Yeah,
She was really fast.
yeah,
I think a normal person would have probably done this talk in an hour, and she did it in half an hour.
yeah.
It was so dense, full of information.
No
But
nonsense though. Just yeah, very much boom, boom, boom.
very much boom, boom, boom. And I, and to give people an idea, this topic was about women in gaming, and particularly computer science and programming and such. And I think that she is like the perfect example of this, of somebody to be able to talk about this, because A, she's been in the industry since 1981 and
Yeah.
she's seen the transformation that's happened. And B, for whatever dumb reason, I don't think I've heard of her until Empire of Sin was announced.
Yeah.
So like, how are you in the industry for this long and then your name's not getting out there? And this is a problem that like happens not just with women but with people in general throughout the
Yeah.
industry. But it's like,
I'd
unless you're
heard
exceptional, you don't really, get your
I
name out there.
I had heard of her, but yeah, besides Empire of Sin, I couldn't tell you what she had done. I actually looked it up. I have it here. Jagged Alliance 2, Wizardry 8, Playboy the Mansion is like a weird outlier in there. Playboy the Mansion, Private Party. Yeah, she's been a writer or director on a lot of stuff, or a game designer, I should say, not director.
Yeah.
That I have heard of. So yeah, it's kind of funny where it's like, yeah, someone who's been in the industry forever, and of course her husband is John Romero, who's Quake and all that or whatever. But it was nice that didn't really come up in her talk. She was
Right.
just mentioned her husband one time, but she was
Yeah.
already in the industry before I think they got together, which is cool.
I think a big part of that talk is really just like dispelling this idea that's come up that, women wouldn't be interested in tech or tech roles. And
Yeah.
one of the crazy little facts that she shared that I was not aware before is that back in the day, computer used to be a job title.
Yeah, it was a person.
Yeah, a person was a computer, and most of those people were young women.
Yeah.
And it was, I think it's, and now that she says it, it kind of sort of makes sense that like, like there's a lot of women that were involved in typing and office work and a lot of those kinds of roles. And I think it was sort of seen as one of those similar types of roles that was sort of on a lower end, but still required a lot of skill.
Well, and that's what she said is like, in the job descriptions at the time, it would be like menial, repetitive work. And it's like, what's funny is like a similar thing happened in the film industry. And it's so funny that things changed over time, like the way they have, because funny cry, I guess, funny, weird. But, like film editors, like off the bat, like a lot of them were women because for whatever reason, it was seen as like women's work, but it's like this highly creative, like maybe some would say like third or fourth most important role on a film, and mostly women in the beginning, early days. Similar thing here where it was like a lot of this back end, and like she talks about how a lot of code was written by invented by women, like assembly languages that were invented by women. Of course, there's Ada Lovelace and all the names but like Wi-Fi was invented by a famous actor, Hedy Lamarr, I think. Stuff like that. But like she was highlighting lesser known figures throughout computing history, which is really cool. It was nice.
Yeah, she had talked about the ENIAC, like one of the first big computers that people know was an all-female coding team. The ZX Spectrum was built by women. And she said in 1983, right around the time, right after she had started in the industry, there was 37% of computer science students were women. And then a couple of decades later, that had dropped down to 17%.
Yeah.
So it's like this clearly, there's like this weird cultural shift that happened in the 80s and 90s.
And she talked briefly about, she I don't think was trying to posit any real theories about like why this happened or anything, but like she did mention, like she showed some ads from the 60s, 70s, and 80s and was like, here's where we were at the time, like
right.
There was one where like a guy was like spanking a woman for like doing whatever. I don't even remember what it was, but it was like, that was an ad. And it's just like, so here's where we were at the time. And I was like, oh yeah.
Yeah, she basically said like as the pay rates went up, then more men came into the industry.
Right.
And more of those men didn't really want to take leadership from women, and so women kind of got pushed out in some degrees. But yeah, I also thought it was really fascinating that like the company that she worked for when she started, it was half and half. Like,
Yeah,
you know, there's 5 men and
literally.
5 women. Yeah,
Yeah.
including her. So that was really interesting and fascinating, but also, like I said, very fast.
Mile a minute. I was happy to be able to pause that one, yeah, and look stuff
Yeah.
up. Yeah.
Yeah, but at the same time, like I was saying, like that was my first GDC session,
Oh, yeah, I
you
watched that one
know?
last. I actually came
Yeah,
around to
and
that one last.
7 a.m. on that Tuesday morning, and like, and it really just put me in that mood. I'm like, okay, this is, you know,
Going to
this is just,
class.
I'm there, I'm with you. The next one, this actually it happened at the same time, was the Control.
Yeah, I also watched
Uh,
this one.
yeah, this is cool. So yeah, you lead off on this since
Yeah,
I think you
yeah.
probably watched it first.
This one's probably my favorite talk. It was just so fascinating. It was actually, I'm looking at my notebook here, and I didn't actually write anything down, it turns out, because I was just so wrapped with it. But I can remember what he was talking about. So basically it was uh they were talking about how Remedy made the destructive environment system for Control. And they've done some stuff talking about this before, and I had known a little bit about it, but it was really nice to see him talking about it on like a peer-to-peer game developer kind of thing. And this is one of those instances where I thought I'd be, head in the water or whatever over my head, out of my element. But it turned out I followed along quite well. He did a really good job explaining everything. So there were rigid bodies that made up the static environments, and then they would apply destruction to those kind of in a really smart way where one part could get destroyed off and the rest would still be there. And the example he gave was a door is a bunch of rigid bodies held together on like hinges and stuff, like, joints that you don't really see with your eyes, but they're in the game. And so that way you could shoot a hole in the middle of the door and the door would just keep staying there, And then
Yeah.
he showed he kept returning to this nice area, which I think was in the open area of the research department. And he would say like, okay, here it is with just the static rigid bodies in the environment and nothing else, no particles, no debris, nothing. It doesn't break apart really to much extent, no decals. And he would like shoot around and stuff. And it, it looked all right. Like things would fall apart and stuff. And you're like, okay, well, and then he's like, okay, now let me show you that with, if we add decals to the stuff, like little things that make it look like an impact spot or deformation on the thing. And it's like, okay, yeah, that makes a lot, and it was kind of interesting because it sort of in a way walked forward through the history of game development and like how, not, this wasn't a part of the talk, but like just watching it felt like doing that, where it's like,
Mm-hmm.
oh yeah, that's how they used to do it. Like on the PS2, like, that thing would fall, or like the PS3, that thing would fall over. And we were all like, whoa, that's so cool, And then he's like, okay, now let me add particles and debris. And that just made, sends it over the top where it's like the dust and stuff. But the coolest thing about it was it's all kind of procedural, not really, procedural in the sense that of actually the meaning where it's like it follows a procedure. Like it has a set of rules that it follows. And so it's like, these rigid bodies are here. They're connected by this joint. If hit here with a certain amount of force, it will break that joint. This part will have this many decals applied. This much particle will come out of it, and it'll break into X number of pieces based on the force. And they just have this system, basically a huge database where everything in the game has those elements applied to it. And so. And he was saying at the end, he was like, key takeaways is like, don't just use a naming system because typos are a real threat to that. Like if someone, if the prop is like wooden desk and like they miss an O in wooden or something, it like won't be queued as wooden and it will not work or look really crazy. But it was really fascinating because like, and they could scale it based in their like custom engine, Torchlight. Or Northlight? Northlight.
Yeah.
Their custom engine, they could scale it up and down to say like, okay, this concrete it's this kind of thing and it breaks in this way, but it's not enough debris, not enough particles, not enough chunks. And so they would like scale it up. And he said like after a while, after they got the basic system in place, the real exercise was just kind of going through the whole game and calibrating that so that everything looked realistic. And they still had to, while still maintaining, optimization and runnability.
Right.
And they said that a rule of thumb was like 200 rigid bodies breakable on screen at any time. And he was like, well, that, you run into problems where that can't always be the case and tra la la. But yeah, I just thought it was such a genius system that they made, and their engine was so smart and well implemented. And it really, the thing about it that's so cool is like once you understand how it works, you're like, yeah, that's obviously a really, really smart way to do this. Why don't more people do it like this? Like why doesn't every game have this?
Right.
It was
Yeah.
very, very cool.
Yeah, the one of the things that kind of started off, we called it the principle of granularity.
Yeah.
And so like you start with first you start with like the room or whatever. So like that can't really be messed with, right?
Yeah.
But
yeah,
it's
you're not
the
going to blow a
props.
hole in the wall. Yeah.
Yeah, but it's the props you put in there. So like the desks and the coffee cups and the plants and all of that. And so those are, your objects. And then the objects split into chunks, and then the chunks split into debris. And so like wood is kind of like I think one of the easiest things to think of, because it's like, okay, your object will turn into, your desk will break into like different jagged boards or whatever. And then those jagged boards will turn into like splinters, and then eventually it'll just be dust.
Yeah.
But one of the things that was interesting later on when he's talking about managing performance and all of that is if there's a couple of guys in the room, throwing grenades everywhere, then it's just all chaos anyways.
Right.
So just skip some of those steps, just like let the desk just automatically blow into splinters and papers flying around.
Yeah, he said that they put like a delay on stuff, so that if so much stuff is happening, yeah, it'll smartly in a really optimized way, not just keep filling the room with more and more dust and debris and tank the frame rate. And I mean like that game had a little bit of trouble on consoles, but like as Digital Foundry said, I think at the time they were like, this thing shouldn't even run at all on current gen consoles, like it was like, so they were impressed by it. But yeah.
Yeah, the amount of physics objects and breakable in that
Bonkers.
game is crazy.
And the only reason again why it all worked was because they had that system, that rules of granularity kind of thing. One part that I liked, when he was talking about the decals layer, which again is like the impact of the deformations.
Yeah, it's basically just a texture. It's like a sticker.
Basically a sticker. Yeah, it's like a sticker on top. And he would show like a cement wall, and it's like under normal circumstances the cement wall just looks like a flat cement wall, and then when it's like 15% ruined, the decals look like this, and then when it's like 100% ruined, the decals look like this. And this is not breaking into chunks when he was showing the decals, and it just looked like terrible. It looked like really bad, chunky, like almost like Minecraft, like cobblestone, just except bigger, like big zoomed in, like crappy, textures. And he was like, yeah, so I know this looks really bad right here, but it's like, you got to think it would be broken into pieces, and you're not going to damage this entire wall. So you're not going to see this like repeating decal.
Oh, sure. Yeah,
you're just going to see like this part of it over here, and it looks great. So it was very, very interesting to kind of look behind the curtain and see how the engine runs. I really, really enjoyed this talk.
The next one that I did was the Erica composer thing with Austin Wintory.
I wanted to watch this one. Maybe I'll go back and watch this one.
This is the one I actually did homework for, because I like played through Erica again the night before.
I like Erica, dude. I really had a good time.
Yeah, and actually, I think a lot of his talk actually ended up just talking about like the development of the game and just like, them going into this genre that has been pretty much abandoned, and trying to make it work. And he had talked about how, it was an era where filmmakers that didn't know how to make games were making these, and game makers that didn't know how to make films were trying to make these.
Yeah.
And so none of it worked. And so like they were really trying to focus on something that he said, like the success requires a focus on character and storytelling, and just keeping that focus on Erica and her perspective through all of these different, splintering pathways that you could go on. And he also, I don't know, I wasn't familiar with this, but he was talking about immersive theater being an inspiration.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. That makes sense.
Yeah. So I didn't know anything about immersive theater.
Oh,
So
really? I've gone to a few. It's pretty wild.
Yeah. So you just walk around and the actors are just around you as if you're, just hanging out.
More or less. Some of them are free form like that, where you can just walk around, do whatever. Some of the other ones, like the one I did, is sort of like a haunted house plus a play. Like they'll kind of usher you through, like the character, like the one I did, like there's a character that's with you and then they get like killed or dragged off and then someone else shows up and takes you to the next place, So like they would, lead you through this like crazy house, but you have to sign a waiver like that they can touch you and stuff.
Oh, sure.
It's bonkers. I went with Huber, actually. I've got some weird stories from that play. I told him not to volunteer me for anything, so like the first thing he did was volunteer me for something. And things got weird. Things got weird. Omar was there too. He had to do some really gnarly stuff. He had to like crawl through a crawl space to get a key or something. Anyway.
Oh, wow, that sounds more like an escape room almost. Yeah.
Yeah, it is a little bit.
But yeah, so from that, he was talking about the courage to basically create content and storylines that would be out of view if the player didn't go there, right? So it's like with immersive theater, like he gave this example of there's this whole thing that could be happening in the women's bathroom, but if you're like preventing yourself from going to the women's bathroom because you think, it's like, oh, I shouldn't go in there. It's like, well, no, you're on a set. You're part of a storyline. Like you can go in there.
Yeah.
But so same thing with Erica. It's like the story is basically it's always moving forward. So like no matter what happens, if you go with this character instead of that character, well, the first character's storyline is still going to happen without you, and you're going to find out what happened to them later.
It's not like literally running it in the background in real time, right? Because it's all pre-scripted. Right. So it's just, you come up to them later. Yeah.
But yeah, so so he wanted her to be strong but emotionally broken, wanted her to feel grounded. He played some of the early themes. I guess, he was trying to get away from like the cello and the violin, but it just like always came back. Like that's the stuff that people like the most.
Yeah.
But he started with 4 themes and whittled it down to 1. And then I don't know if you remember this from because it's probably been a while, but there was this aria for Delphi that he had to write that was music that was in the game. So there was a record that was kind of like this 50s doo-wop record that she finds and like actually says A Wintry on the printed record. So he like had to make this thing, that they made into a real vinyl record for the shoot.
Oh, wow.
And then they also worked it out on piano in another scene later on. He talked a lot about his kind of like pet peeves with implementation of game music in terms of like just there being like a lot of just like, purposeless crossfades. It's like you go from combat into like an emotional scene and then go back into combat.
Right.
Yeah. And there's not really like, there's not like an arc of the music taking you through there. So he's like really just spent a lot of his time, going through like what are all of the different possibilities for the choices people could make and making that sound natural and intentional rather than, oh, you pick this music, switches over to track 3.
Right. Yeah, so like did he talk about because like you said it was like 5 hours of filmed content or whatever, but that means that he would, with all the branches, presumably, like, because one scene could play out like 4 or 5 or 6 different ways sometimes, he would have to make 4 or 5 or 6 different tracks for that scene.
He said he had hundreds of different cues and alternate transitions.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's wild. And did he mention how the game implemented that? Like, is the game simultaneously playing like several of the tracks and it's just got the volume down on one, and if you choose this thing it crossfades them, or
I think it really just comes down to like contingencies. I think maybe it just gets to a point where the music is kind of okay on its own, and then when you make the choice, or one thing I didn't even think about with this game is you as a player you can not make a choice, and the
Different
time will just
times,
run
yeah.
out. Yeah,
Yeah.
so there's just so many different variables as to how it can all work out. And they had to like and I think part of it, I think it just comes down to work, because they talked about they had to like strenuously test the mix for each and every possible variation, because
Yeah.
it's like you don't want there to be any differences in volumes or anything like that as well. So
Right.
to just go from like, okay, we're going to go from A to B to C to A to C to B to A to C to D, just like every combination you can come through.
Just hours
Um,
and hours of testing, yeah. Jeez.
and then because the game has so many different alternatives, he has also talked about just the challenge of putting together a soundtrack album for it, because he didn't want to canonize any
Right.
specific uh, sequence of events.
He'll have to release like 30 albums and do it like Clue did it when it was in theaters, and just like you get whichever version you get, and say like, oh, or it could have happened like this.
So yeah, so that was cool, and like Austin was in the chat, and so
Oh,
I
cool, yeah.
since I just played the game, I like poked fun of. I mentioned that it was I appreciated when the developers, the writers, have pretty much poked fun of him a little bit, because
Uh,
when the girls are playing the piano, they're like, "Oh yeah, it's fun. I've never heard of this guy before."
that's funny. Uh, should we move to the next one that I did?
Yeah.
So I did. We watched Astroneer
Oh, cool.
mining. What is it? Mining your own. But I didn't write down the title of the talk, but it was about like how they were iterating on their mining system and just talking about that. And it was very nitty gritty to if you've played Astroneer or not. And my roommate Omar and I both played a good bit of that. So like we were sitting there and we were like, oh yeah, okay, that makes sense. And they're mostly just talking about um, this talk, which I noticed a few of the talks kind of took on this kind of modality where it's like uh, we're just gonna do our example and then say like these are the lessons we took from that example. So it was less of a broad strokes like here's how you make a mining system. It was like here's everything we did and here's maybe what you can learn from that because here's what we learned from that. But long story short, they talked about iterating and making things too complicated or not complicated enough. They talked about a term that I liked a lot was cognitive load,
Mm.
and it's you always. He says that in game design, you always hear about it as you worry about having too much cognitive load, but they realized you could also have too little because if you have too little cognitive load, you get bored, and if you have too much, you get confused. So they were like, how do we make the mining system really feel like ride that line of always being engaging and interesting, but never feeling overwhelming and confusing and making sense the whole time. And so like they also wanted to root out negative player motivations. They would always ask
Interesting.
them. They would always ask themselves, "What do we want the player to do, and what is this for?" And so like if they found that a player was just farming soil so that they could turn it into a thing that they wanted, they were like, okay, well, that's not exactly what we want them to be doing here. So that means something is out of whack. And it was just a bunch of that kind of little stuff where they would iterate and iterate. And then they ended up putting out, a while back, they put out the crafting or creative update that they did. And it was just interesting to hear them talk about all that in the process and stuff. So it was good. Yep.
Nice. My second morning was with Brandon Sheffield from Digital Eclipse and Necrosoft, and is basically he called it game dev archaeology. Uh,
Cool.
and this is like really cool stuff. And you know, if you're not familiar with them, they've done like a lot of the SNK collections and Street Fighter collections, and he was really just talking about a lot of that process of getting and preserving some of these things that you know, have in some ways been pretty much lost to time. And he's, you know, says in some of those cases he pretty much has like I think he said with Street Fighter they had pretty much no developer access, and so it's just piecing together things from old interviews from magazines and stuff like that. But with SNK and some of these other things, he's, you know, been able to piece together more and more relationships. And he really talked about how it was almost kind of ironic in this situation because we're watching him over a recorded thing, and now we're all talking over a recorded, uh, you know, interviews and such. And but he was saying that like this is work that you can't do over a phone call or a video call. Like you actually really need to get in and talk to people and go out to dinner with them and spend, you know, several days with them. And he talked about how with some of those SNK employees, like some of the stories he got out of them was only because, you know, like, hey, let's go take a walk down to where the building used to be, and then they remembered about something that used to be across the street, and they got all this new information and such out of
Wow.
them.
I had no idea they were going that in depth with these things. That's awesome.
Yeah, and so like a lot of this stuff really comes down to relationships and trust. And he was talking about how the I guess the guy who manages the archive from SNK, you know, in terms of like just where they like store and preserve like all of their old artwork and magazine stuff and packaging. Uh, that guy was notorious for, you know, like nobody was allowed to go into that room. Nobody could go in there and touch that stuff or look around or poke into that kind of thing. And people that Brandon was talking to were like, yeah, you're not gonna be able to do this. And like, well, just email him and tell him that, you know, that Brandon is here, right? And it turned out that again, because this guy is just like really into these kind of things, and Brandon had worked on an earlier art book on a different SNK collection, and I think he did something like he just like they needed somebody to. He was like, somebody needs to copy edit this, and they didn't have anyone, so like, well, I'll just do it. And I think he might not even been paid on the project. You know, he
Oh
just like
wow.
this art book needs to be copy edited, and then they put this like special thanks to Brandon Sheffield on like the back page or something. And the guy recognized him from that back page and like, oh, come on up, and showed him all of this stuff, like the original logo, you know, drawings and all of that.
That's wild.
And then the other like crazy story is there was some old arcade machine that they only knew about from basically magazine ads. And it was like just like a breakout game. You know, there's like tons of these breakouts clones that were around back in the day. And so he got a lead on this guy, this warehouse where there's, you know, there's one here, and it required him to take all of these buses and trains to this small Japanese town that only has like 10,000 people. And there's this guy there that basically is preserving all of these old arcade boards. And it's just him and an assistant. And he literally has a drawer for every single Japanese arcade machine that was ever made. And a lot of them he doesn't have the actual boards for, but just even having like the organization to like the cataloging is a huge, you know, resource of information.
So he's just got an empty drawer for X game, hoping to
Right,
someday fill it.
right.
Man, that's hardcore. I like that. That's cool.
And he's been at it for like, you know, I think 20 or 40 years or something like that. I forget how long he
Wow.
had said. Um, and but similarly with this guy, and I think this is either whether it's cultural, like US to Japan, or generational or whatever, like it's just so opposite of like how I tend to think of business meetings, right? Because when I think of a business meeting, it's like, okay, let's go in, let's do the thing we're here for, and then let's get out.
Yeah.
You know, just get the job done. and be efficient. Whereas this guy, when he went to meet him, even though he had done all this traveling and taken so long to get there anyways, he's like, he wanted to talk to Brandon for like hours before
Wow.
he could go back in and look at this machine that he came to see. And then finds out all this stuff about how it was made and built, and like basically, recognize that everything that they thought they knew about this machine was wrong. It was a very, it was put together very differently.
Wow. That's
And
really
then,
cool.
yeah, and then the last big story was talking about the Samurai Showdown Perfect Edition, which made it into the recently released Samurai Showdown collection. And this was passed around in some news stories recently as well. But basically, this previously was only known by like some random Japanese tiny website with some like photographs of this machine, because it had only been put out there for a couple of hours for like a focus test. And so he had gotten to talk to one of the guys, and what had happened was that basically, there was just like some corporate shakeups going on, and like, the people that were making the games and the people that were owning the company and shifting ownership of the company and leadership were just not in sync. And so the people that were in charge were like, hey, we're not going to put that out. And they pulled it. And so anyway, so he got to talking to the guys that were there, that were designing at the time. And it was only because he had like an approved person next to him, telling them it's okay to talk about this, because for years and years, decades, it had been a secret.
Oh.
And then so he's telling him like over dinner or something about the story about this machine, and he's like, I think one of my old coworkers actually has it, and then he was able to go and like dump the ROM, and then he translated it there in like record time, just because there's a story mode that's not in any of the other versions of the game. And then now it's on the collection. Now this game that nobody had ever had any idea what it was before, you can go on to whatever console or Epic Game Store or whatever and play it.
Wow.
So
It's like, man, I really appreciate that. Like man, I didn't know. I guess it makes sense now that I hear about it, but it's like, man, you just don't realize the amount of legwork that, like, real life legwork that has to go into these collections.
yeah, and like those guys are staffing up, right? Like Brandon Sheffield's been working there for a while. Frank Cifaldi's been working there with them for a while. Chris Kohler just got hired over there, and so did Drew Scanlon. So like,
Yeah.
But the kind of 4 takeaways he said at the end was, you need to be able to get people to talk. You need to be able to find hidden stuff. You need to be able to get permission. And then you need the money to be able to back the work. You basically need to have an official reason. And that's one of the
Right.
hardest things. He teased, he knows a former employee of some company that has an unreleased, partially built Super Famicom RPG, but he doesn't have the project to be able to like go forward and get it.
Right. Right.
He just needs
Jeez.
that project to be able to, show
Man,
this thing to the world.
he must speak fluent Japanese too, right? Like,
Yeah. Yeah,
yeah.
I know. Yeah, I'm pretty sure he does, and Chris Kohler does. So,
Yeah, wow. What a skill. I'm jealous.
so yeah, one of the cooler talks for sure.
Very cool. Uh, the next one I did was how to go from hobbyist to professional. I had high hopes for this one. It sort of delivered. It was mostly things that kind of you already know. Key takeaways were start small. Because everyone has this like pie in the sky game idea they want to do that's some crazy big thing, and he was just like, start small, try to finish and deliver a project. Even if deliver just means like have a couple of friends play it. You don't have to maybe put it out to sell it if you don't want to. Um, but yeah, and try putting a time limit on yourself, try a game jam, do multiple smaller projects that teach you things that might be useful for your big dream project, because then you're learning as you go. and it's don't be hard on yourself if the things you make outright aren't very good.
Right.
So yeah, like that the main takeaways were those, like, start small, try to finish something, timelines, deadlines, accountability, all the standard kind of like, how do you start and finish things? How do you get things done? How do you move forward? So yeah, it that was that.
Very cool. My next one, this one I'll probably be a little bit briefer on because it is very much in a technical sense. It was a physical animation in Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order.
Oh yeah, yeah.
And it was stuff, it was like one of the guys from Respawn really talking about how they applied physics and merged that with their animation systems, and just really going through and talking about like a lot of the iterative process in that. And so I guess the basic way to frame it is that if you just have the animation that the designers made, then you end up having a lot of unnatural things that happen, right? So like you have, if your arm is supposed to go all the way back behind you, then you're going to clip through the wall. Or he showed this one example where like a stormtrooper gets blasted back, and it's like when it hits the corner of the wall, rather than convincingly hitting the wall, it just sort of stops and then slides down in that, like, the kind of lay down pose kind of thing. And so adding physics onto the animations allows everything to kind of feel a lot more natural, allows for more collisions. You could like force pull an enemy and then move it around, and like it would collide with the boxes and all of that. But a lot of it came down to like finding those balances, right? So, for instance, with hitting the wall, basically they created a flag towards like, okay, once the the enemy hits the wall, then basically enable ragdoll, and then it collides with the wall naturally and crumples on the ground. But then a lot of it was really about merging those two things. And so, like, if you have even something as simple as a walk animation or turning around, they have like these animation targets, but then they're like, okay, well, add the physics here, and they would show the difference between the target and like what the physics would do, and then it would show them kind of sliding things back and forth. And
Mhm.
so it's just like it's an interesting way of essentially making everything feel a lot more natural and not as canned and stiff. Um, but then finding the balance so that it's not too much.
Yeah.
So he would show certain examples where like here, just like he's just like constantly wobbling around. So let's find the constraint, or let's use another technique to kind of rein this in and make it feel more dynamic, but also not like it's jiggling all over the place.
Yeah, for sure.
One
Um,
of the things I thought was really funny about it, though, just in terms of the way he was talking, is like a director or a story guy would be always using like character names, right?
right.
Throughout this whole talk, he would just always like refer to like the player character as hero, and like BD1 is droid. Like he was like pretty much never called them out by
That's
name.
I would always when I'm early stages writing notes for like a narrative thing, I always abbreviate main character as just MC, and sometimes that carries over for a long time where I'm just like, okay, and then the MC will do this and this, and sometimes people are like, what? The next things I saw weren't talks; they were music.
Mhm.
So GDC, they've always had cool musical things and like wellness things. This time, like several times throughout the day, they have in the morning they would have like wellness or mindfulness meditation things and like tai chi and yoga and stuff later in the day. Um, I didn't look at any of that stuff this time, but they would end the nights with musicians. And I think the first night, maybe the second night, was Insane in the Rain. And
Oh, that's first night, yeah.
yeah, at first night I saw like 10 minutes of it. I didn't see the whole thing, but just a multi-instrumentalist. It was very cool. He had a lot of different instruments,
He was doing a
saxes and
lot with
stuff.
tracks. So he'd
Yeah,
like play one
looping and
instrument, lay
yeah.
it down, yeah.
And then something that you and I saw a good deal of. I saw maybe a quarter or half of it. Um, was 88 keys.
88 bit.
88 bit. That's right. There are
But
88
that's
keys
the
on a
but that's the
piano.
pun. Yeah, that's the
Yeah,
pun.
that's the joke. But he's very cool. You can find him on YouTube too. But plays classic 8-bit music, but on a piano, but in a way that sometimes I'm like, how are you even moving your hands that fast? Like it was pretty crazy. It sounded like an 8-bit um, thing, but coming out of an actual analog piano, because he's just doing those really tight little chords and stuff.
Yeah,
But
it was
that was very
crazy.
cool.
He played a lot of stuff that I was very familiar with, which I think helped this a lot too. He's like started off with Bloody Tears from Castlevania 2, played the entire RC Pro Am soundtrack from
Yeah,
David Wise, played pretty much all of the Star Tropics soundtrack.
which was really funny because he was like he would play a thing and then be like, you know, and he'd like go through all the tracks and then he would just be done and he'd like, that's it. Soundtrack for that game is 3 minutes long. Like it's like, oh okay.
Yeah, and there's Marble Madness, Mega Man 2, Final Fantasy. But yeah, like you were saying, like someone in chat while I was in there joked that like, you know, that he has 3 hands.
Yeah.
Because we're just so fast and just it's insane to me. You know, piano players are already kind of insane, but to see somebody at this speed.
Well, especially like I play, you know, keyboards a little bit and I took years of lessons, but it's like nowhere near that. Like could not do that. Like that was very, very cool. Yeah. And that's everything I saw.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I've got a couple more to go. The one I probably won't really get into is was latency variation in modern warfare.
Yo.
You know, it was like really talking through like very technical stuff about like, you know, predicting like the highs and lows of somebody's latency and like borrowing frames and you know
Wow.
and like balancing between like you know, accuracy and latency and stuff like that, and just talking about going I think they had gone from like 20 hertz servers up to 60 hertz servers, and so they had less frames to borrow from.
Oh, okay.
So everything had to be a lot more accurate, but a lot of it honestly, it's like one of these things where it's like I could barely follow along, so trying to explain it back to you, there
Right.
were a lot of graphs and waves and like pushing sine waves up and down and
Well, that's the like having talked about online games with game developer friends of mine like Jason and whoever, like netcode stuff, it just seems like witch magic. It's like
right.
really hard to get to do well. I mean, if it was easier to do well, more games would have good netcode, right? But like, yeah, it sounds crazy.
Yeah, because you're talking about like a basic situation that'll happen is like, you know, one person will, you know, because of the delay between the two people, one person will fake they're behind cover, but the other person shot, you know, when their crosshairs were over their head.
Right.
It's like, well, it's unfair, or like they both shot first, or, you know, situations
Right.
like that. And so
yeah, how do you parse that stuff? It's crazy.
yeah, well, then that's the thing. They were talking about the client clocks versus the world clock on the server, and there's like this, all kinds of stuff.
Yeah, like it breaks my head. I don't even want to like try to think of it. It's like they have to design like good netcode is kind of time travel. Like they're like in music stuff you have look ahead where it's like a thing can look ahead at and analyze music or a sound wave before, you know, the playhead gets to it and apply an effect to it in real time before you get there, right? Like a pre-delay or yeah, look up stuff, and it's just like they're basically programming stuff to do that in real time to like guess what you're gonna do, and then if it's right, it stays there, and if it was wrong, it has to change. It's just like what? It's like
Yeah,
nuts.
the I'll go back to something else that I did before, but the one of the other ones that I did was Mortal Kombat 11, music and Leitmotiv by Will Roger.
Yeah.
This was great, and like anytime you start off a talk by talking about Final Fantasy VI and playing examples, I'm there.
Well, it's a good leitmotif example because yeah, it uses that.
Yeah, and he explained, the concept of leitmotif, and he talked about the contrast between like a melodic theme and a leitmotif, whereas like a melodic theme is reused without much modification whatsoever, whereas a leitmotif, um, it can vary and morph and mutate in different ways based on the situation, and
Yeah.
it's generally associated with a character or a place or something specific.
Like
And
Star Wars uses them a lot where it's like
yeah,
Luke's theme or Rey's theme will like pepper into the background on a different instrument and you may not even notice it necessarily, but the theory is you get the feeling of that, like, oh, Rey's gonna save the day or be heroic or something because her theme is peppered in there. Sometimes it's even like subconscious. Like some composers get really wild with it where it's like somebody's like a character's leitmotif or something will be like in the subharmonics or something, like real subliminal stuff. But yeah, it's cool.
And then he also talked about that it's shorter and simpler. So like a lot of the times it would just be like 4 or 5 notes,
Yeah.
and then because of that you're able to work it in or like counterbalance them against each other. And he played some examples from that. But with Mortal Kombat specifically, what's crazy is Mortal Kombat, unlike a lot of like we're talking about like Japanese games, is never had character themes. Their music has always been based on the stages,
Oh
basically.
yeah, you're right. Yeah.
It's just about location, and those locations really weren't that closely associated with any characters. So he wrote leitmotifs for basically the entire cast. Um, but even more than that, though, he was really talking about them being uh, yeah, so he had like a large orchestral score and then the background of all of these different leitmotifs, but they would be he went through like an introduction of a bunch of characters. And so the orchestral score was sort of like the overarching, this is just like for the game, for the event, for the situation. But then like a lot of the leitmotifs would be more based on like world instruments or electronic instruments or like heavy metal guitars, and so
Sure.
they'd stand out a lot more. Um, and then he also talked about how they had like a family theme that was used for like Sonya, Cassie, and Johnny
Johnny
Cage.
Cage. Yeah.
Yeah, and then Jax and Jackie, and so that kind of got played up. So with like Sonya, it was an acoustic guitar. With Cassie, it was an electric guitar because she was younger. And with
Uh-huh.
Jax, there was more brass for the military theme. And so yeah, so just like a lot of he just kind of walked through like a lot of these different themes and like playing out these different situations so that you could really like hear how they interact, and how like one character's theme feeds into another. So it was pretty cool. And then even to hear, even in like the end credits, they did like a rap song with like Mega Ran and some other people, and like even in there you could hear some of those main themes, the main like combat and theme and stuff interspersed. So
Man, I love stuff like that. That's really cool.
yeah. So it's like one of those things where like I could try to recap it, but like you really need to hear all of it. So hopefully
Yeah, yeah.
that's one that maybe gets released later on. But the thing I wanted to end on though was something I actually kind of didn't expect, in that I kind of got game impressions.
Oh.
The last morning they had experimental gameplay workshop in which they had, I don't know, like 10 different people like go through uh, different game designs that they had come up with and kind of show them off. And it was pretty cool and kind of all over the place, as you would expect from GDC. The first one was called Pants Off,
Uh-huh.
and it's basically an escape room made out of pants.
Okay. Like you
It took
do.
them 24 hours to make, and it takes 10 minutes for you to get out of them. Which is like all these like layers of pants and buckles and locks and things
That's
that
very funny.
you have to sort out how to get off of you. Next one was Kine, which is it's been featured in some of these other like indie showcases and stuff over the summer. It's been out for a little
Sounds
while.
familiar. Yeah.
I think it got a bit more of its buzz like during one of the Stadia things because it would look real different. But it was like basically you have these characters that are like musical instruments, but they're also blocky, and so they move by like rotating on like this grid.
Okay.
But because they're different shapes, like one has a trombone or whatever, you kind of have to like slide the trombone and figure out how to use that shape to get across a cap or get under, an obstacle or whatever. And I've been curious about this game. I haven't played it, but what's interesting is that she basically designed it to tell these characters stories through the gameplay mechanics. And so, like, as you're working your way through all of this stuff, like some characters form relationships and fall in love and break up, and like it all happens throughout the course of just this kind of, cute little puzzle game.
Huh.
Um, I'm trying to remember. Oh, the longing. This is a crazy concept to me. So, it's a mix of an idle game and an adventure game. And I think there are certain things that you can do to speed it up, but it essentially will take you 400 days to complete.
What's it
And
called? The
the
Longing?
longing, yeah. And this is made by a guy in Germany, and basically there's certain things that even happen while you aren't playing. So like one of the examples is there's sort of like a bowl kind of shape and a cliff, but there's water dripping. And so after you've waited long enough, then that water will fill up into a pool that you can then swim across and then climb. You can actually they've got like whole books in there to like pass the time. Like you can read like Moby Dick or whatever in the game. And then another example they talked about is you'll be in, again, a lot of the things happen in like caves and stuff, but you'll be on like this like layered like mine shaft, right? And you'll see that one of the beams on the layer below you is cracked and broken. And so the way to get below you is to just have your character stand above that beam for 5 minutes.
Yeah.
Then eventually your weight will cause it to crumble and then you can move on. So it's just interesting to like, yeah, using actual time as a game mechanic and just
Yeah.
having a game just run in the background while you do other things.
Jeez. Yeah. Wow. Weird.
Shattered Lights, very cool sounding freaking VR game. Basically, they have designed it. I forget what the term was, but they've designed it in a way so that you never will have to use like an analog stick or teleport function. Every step that you take throughout this whole game happens in a standard VR play space.
Okay.
And so there's just like a lot of tricks to where basically they say that like they teleport you without you knowing it. So you go around this corner and then the path that you take around the corner, it would be impossible if like all of these hallways were like actually placed on top of each other, but it always like leads you back in to stay within the play space. So if they're like really focused on making it very immersive and feel very natural because you're just walking around and interacting with things and picking up things. And they're using like a lot of audio and lighting to draw your eye and draw your attention to certain areas.
So basically, it's like a bunch of corridors that keep you walking in a tight circle, kind of,
Yeah.
without you kind of realizing it. I mean, that's a really
Yeah.
smart. That's a really smart idea.
Yeah. So they said it's designed for the 3x3 play space, and then you can reduce it. But the more you reduce it, then it basically is accelerating. So it, increases your chance of getting motion sickness.
Oh, sure,
Um,
yeah.
but yeah, and then it is a horror game, so there are some jump scares and stuff in there. But they say like the jump scares are sort of optional. Toward I think basically if you're not in the right place at the right time, you'll miss some of those things.
Huh.
So
Let's hope. Let's hope that I don't get to the right place at the right time.
There's another cool game called Viewfinder that reminded me a little bit of Superliminal.
Okay.
And so essentially the idea is that you'll take a photograph and then you'll hold the photograph up to a certain place in the scene, and then you sort of let it stick, and then that actually becomes space that you can walk through. So like,
Oh, okay. Kind of like
if you need,
Gorogoa too.
yeah, so if you need to get to a door, for instance, then you get a photograph of a door and you put the door in front of you, and then that's as simple as walking through the door.
Is this one
Uh,
VR as well or no?
no, this is not
Oh,
a
okay.
VR game,
Okay.
but it's based on a lot of optical illusions, and you can actually take photographs at a certain point. And so sometimes your solution is to like take a photo of a photo of a photo of a photo and just create like this chain. And it's designed so that there's not always set solutions. There's multiple ways of going through things and
Hmm.
finding your way through how the game works.
What's that
Um,
one called?
Viewfinder,
Viewfinder. That sounds
yeah.
cool.
And so like one uh, thing he was talking about was like, well, you can take a photo of a box and you can put it on the button, or you can take a photo of a button and put it under the box. It's just like, how are you going to relate to it? How you're going to see the world?
Yeah.
Um,
Huh.
or like take that box and make 6 photos, and now you have 6 boxes. So, yeah.
That's cool.
Probably the most intimidating. It's called the Devil's Calculator, where each
Okay.
level you have to calculate the number 666. And
Right up your alley, Bloodworth.
but it's all mathematical, and so basically they're like
Blech.
these operators like diamonds and pitchforks and things, and it's like you're trying to figure out what that you know it could be as simple as like a diamond equals adding 4 to everything, or it could be as complex as a diamond equals 2x minus 6, and you're trying to solve for what that symbol is and potentially multiple symbols, and then get your way to to
My
doing the calculation.
my friend Jason will like that one. I'm gonna.
Yeah. And they're putting in like a full level editor too, so that like people can create their own puzzles as well.
I love
Oh,
that.
and they're
That's
having levels from famous mathematicians. So as if it weren't hard enough with them doing it on their own.
yeah. Well, Bloodworth, I've recently gotten into watching what is it called? Cracking the Cryptic.
Mm.
It's a YouTube channel where you just watch this dude do hard Sudoku puzzles. It's wonderful. He's so delightful and chill, and he's so just genuinely excited by these damn Sudokus. I recommend it. The Miracle is a really good one to start with because he's just like flabbergasted. It's magnificent. Anyway,
And then the last ones are pretty quick. One was called Bizarre Barber, was another VR game, but it was made to be a little bit more accessible, and so you also don't move in this one. You just kind of stand in place, and then the game kind of comes at you, kind of like Beat Saber,
oh
and you're
okay.
just cutting hair of all kinds of weird things. There's like they show. I think the most common one they showed was like there are trains going by you, and people with long hair are sticking their heads out of the trains, and you're like chopping the hair while the trains go by.
That's funny.
So and then then they also talked about having because the game is sort of stressful on its own, they talked about having anti-bosses, so that rather than increasing the stress between levels, they reduce it and make you feel
Oh,
chill and more creative.
that's fun. I like that.
And then the last two, the one I didn't quite understand what the heck it was, other than it was a co-op VR game, but it was called Sleeping Baby Hungry Birds. And the presentation on that was just like they talked a lot about the design iterations, but it didn't quite understand what it ended up being. The bird, there's a baby in his co-op, and I don't okay. But they're talking about like maybe like one person like using the controller while another person has a headset, and that kind of
Huh.
idea. And then the last one was called these aren't the last two. I just like put a lot of space on things. Um sorry. But there's one called Crescent Loom where they're like using like your muscle impulses as inputs into the game.
Huh.
Um, there is a cool puzzle game called Patrick's Parabox, where basically there's like blocks that you move around, but like there's puzzles nested inside of those boxes, and so it gives this like crazy like meta go into it and go out of it, and like zooming in and out of a lot of different levels and recursive systems.
Cool.
And then now the actual last one, which is free to download on itch.io, and I want to play when we get back in the studio because it's a really cool co-op game called Trail Mix.
Okay.
And basically you have two characters going through the game together, and then you meet other people on the trail, and so it sort of extends. So it's almost like blocks or like boxes, like Tetris pieces. So like if you find another character, then you have like a 2-block character that you're moving around, and then that is something that the other player can essentially use as a platform to make the jump across, and then you can sort of like throw the other, whatever, the guy that's attached to you across to them.
Right.
And so yeah, it kind of felt a lot like sort of snipper clips or whatever.
Sure. Okay.
And that there's like a lot of situations that again aren't necessarily one solution. There's a lot of different ways to get through things.
Yeah, that sounds fun.
Like Box Boy might be another good example.
How many players is it?
It's a 2-player.
Oh, 2-player. Okay.
Yeah.
Cool.
So yeah, that's
GDC.
a lot of things. GDC.
Pretty eventful for not being an event.
For not being an event, it was actually pretty. I was pleased by the amount of cool stuff I was able to get out of it.
Me too.
Even without stuff that I was looking forward to, like the Animal Crossing panel and all of that, and obviously not getting to see these people in person.
Not getting to go to the cool parties, Bloodworth.
Yeah.
There's a party called That Party, and it's great.
Yeah, I was lined up to do some stuff with Ben Hansen there and everything.
Oh, fun, yeah. Well, maybe in 2 or 3 years.
It's good times. Thanks for chatting.
Yeah. Bye.
Bye.